Living in a world full of heroes might sound incredible, right? Well, The Boys shows us that it would probably be the complete opposite. Here, heroes do not save people because they are good. They do it for fame, power, or money. It is the exact opposite of the more familiar heroes some of us grew up with. Because in this world, abuse, negligence, and violence are things we see every single day. And one of the clearest examples is A-Train, a selfish, cowardly character who is responsible for some of the worst things in the series. But while the comic turns him into a monster who is almost impossible to defend, the show decided to do something different, because behind all that fame and speed, there was someone terrified of being left behind. And that leaves one question. Can someone like A-Train really change? Or rather, Reggie Franklin is the main speedster of the seven, and also the character who triggers almost the entire story of The Boys after accidentally killing Robin, Hughie's girlfriend. And from here, the show and the comic take completely different paths, and that ends up defining the character in a major way. In the comic, A-Train kills Robin by accidentally throwing a villain into her, and the worst part is not the accident, it is his reaction, because he shows no guilt, no sadness, not even empathy. The only thing he says is, "You people have someone who deals with this stuff, right?" Before simply running off as if Robin were nothing more than trash that got in his way. And that really is comic book A-Train, a selfish, cruel character completely consumed by his own ego. Because while the show gives us someone horrible who acts out of fear, the comic gives us someone horrible because he genuinely feels superior. The show's A-Train makes terrible decisions because he is afraid of losing his status, his image, even his place. That is why he desperately clings to staying relevant, even when he can no longer run. But in the comic, there is none of that insecurity. There is no guilt. There is only ego. In that world, supes feel like gods compared to humans, and even among themselves there are hierarchies, and A-Train is part of that problem. So much so that he even takes part in the abuse of Starlight, something that probably even the show version of him would find unthinkable. And in fact, many of the things A-Train does in the comics do not even appear in the show, because a large part of that personality and those actions were transferred to the deep instead. And honestly, I think that was one of the best decisions the adaptation made, because without that, people probably never would have connected with A-Train the way they did. The show avoids taking the character to a point where it becomes completely impossible to empathize with him, because in the comics, A-Train is practically another monster on Homelander's level. In the show, we see how A-Train gradually starts to get tired of the abuse, the humiliation, and the control Homelander has over everyone. And as he starts losing his fear, he also begins to realize something important. Homelander is nothing without his powers, and A-Train even reaches the point of standing up to him. But in the comic, everything is different. You can feel that pressure A-Train lives under even more strongly. Even when Homelander hits him, he just stands there terrified. Homelander beats A-Train after he makes fun of the abuse against Starlight. But the worst part is that he does not even do it to defend her. He does it because they were in an official meeting, and according to him, that kind of thing should not be done there. And that says so much about how twisted this world is, because even when someone gets called out for doing evil, it is not to correct them or help them grow the way other heroes might, but simply because they broke certain rules. And A-Train never learns anything from it. He keeps harassing Annie, and even tries to abuse her again, but he does it only to humiliate her, because, as he himself says, there are no consequences for someone in the Seven. And the worst part is that he is right, because for almost the entire comic, the supes live like gods, incapable of facing real consequences. Even though Annie manages to defend herself, A-Train's reaction ends up being even more humiliating, because he runs straight to Homelander to complain like a little kid, basically asking, "And what are you going to do about it?" proving just how cowardly and pathetic he really can be. And that is exactly what separates both versions of the character. Because while the comic uses A-Train as a symbol of corruption, the show uses him to talk about guilt, ego, and humanity. And one of the biggest differences between the show's A-Train and his comic counterpart is that he always had people by his side. People who in one way or another forced him to face the consequences of his actions. His brother Nate is probably the best example, because from the very first season, it is made clear that for much of his life, it was just the two of them. And even though Reggie makes mistake after mistake, Nate never truly abandons him. They argue, they grow apart, They even disappoint each other, but Nate is always there. And he is not the only one. Characters like Popclaw, Hughie, and end up influencing him much more than it seems. Because when A-Train causes Popclaw's death, we see something we had never really seen in him before: guilt. At first, he tries to blame Hughie for what happened. But over time, he ends up accepting that it was his own decision, that no one forced him. And even if that seems small, for someone who always justified everything he did, it is a huge step. And maybe the most important relationship in his development is precisely the one he has with Hughie, because Hughie represents the consequence A-Train was never able to leave behind. After Robin's death, for years he tries to convince himself that it was just an accident, that she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the guilt is still there. And we see him apologize, try to make up for the damage, and even stand against Homelander, because for the first time he wants to do something right without expecting anything in return. But for me, the real beginning of his development comes later. When Nate ends up paralyzed after one of Blue Hawk's attacks, A-Train demands justice, and that is when Ashley gives him the harshest reality check in the entire series. Because she reminds him of something he had spent years ignoring. Robin, Popclaw, and all the collateral damage. All the lives that were destroyed because of his choices. And the question Ashley asks him is devastating. Why does it matter now? Because this time the victim was your brother. And that is where we understand that A-Train is still a hypocrite. But we also understand that he is beginning to change. And as I mentioned at the beginning, both versions of A-Train live in fear of Homelander, but only one of them manages to overcome it. This is exactly where we see the biggest difference between both versions of the character. When Homelander kills Black Noir and then humiliates the Seven by calling them useless and reminding them how little they mean to him, something changes in A-Train. Because for the first time, he stops looking at him with admiration, stops looking at him with fear, and begins to see him for what he really is: an insecure man who is only imposing because of his powers. And throughout Season 4, we see A-Train stop bowing his head and begin to act on his own, even knowing the consequences that could bring. And that matters, because for much of the series, he was never a real hero. His rescues, his achievements, and most of the image Vought sold were little more than marketing. And when he saves Mother's milk and a child watches him, something different happens. Because for the first time, he feels like he did something good, without cameras, without contracts, and without expecting anything in return. And as he himself says, that felt better than anything he had ever done at Vought, because for the first time, he did not hate himself. And I think that is the moment when A-Train finally understands what it means to be a hero. It is not about running faster, it is not about being more famous, it is not about standing above everyone else, but about doing the right thing even when no one is watching. That is why, when his final confrontation with Homelander arrives, we see the peak of all his development. Because he could have run away, he could have chosen the easy path one more time, but when a woman appears in his path, he understands that running through her to save himself would turn him back into the person he used to be. It would take him back to the same mistake that started this whole story. So he chooses to avoid her, even if that means losing his life, because by that point he is no longer running from consequences, no longer trying to protect his fame or preserve his place in the Seven. He is trying to be better, and most importantly, he stops being afraid of Homelander. He understands that behind all that strength and power there is no God, only an empty man who needs everyone to fear him in order to feel important. While Homelander remains a slave to his ego, A-Train finally manages to free himself from his own. And that is why he dies laughing, not because he won, but because he finally understands that he changed. That the man who started this story no longer exists, and that even if people stop believing in you, there is always the possibility of becoming someone better. Because change can be slow, even for the fastest man in the world. And even with everything beautiful I just mentioned, we still have the contrast of the comic, a version of A-Train who never makes any effort to learn from his mistakes. We see him during Herogasm, taking part in all the excess and abuse that define the soups in this world. We see him witnessing the consequences of Homelander's actions. But we also see how little by little everything starts collapsing, and even then he does not change, because unlike the show, this A-Train has no one who makes him question himself. He does not have Nate. He never had a Popclaw. He has no one to show him another path. He is surrounded only by people who are just as horrible as he is, or even worse. And that ends up defining his fate when he discovers, together with the Deep, that nothing Homelander is planning is going to end well. Both of them consider running away, and A-Train agrees, but it is already too late. In the end, Butcher gives Hughie something he had been waiting years for, A-Train. And along with him, a recording of the day Robin died. A recording that reveals something even worse than the accident itself, the indifference. Because even after killing an innocent person, A-Train barely seems affected. He shows a little concern, and Homelander simply reminds him that all of them have done worse things, that what happened is not such a big deal, and A-Train accepts that answer. And when Hughie finally confronts him, A-Train tries to save himself. He begs, he makes excuses, he tries to say anything that might keep him alive. But there is something Butcher understands perfectly. People like A-Train never really listen. You can give them speeches, you can show them the damage they caused, you can give them a second chance, and they still will not learn anything, because they never wanted to learn. And when Hughie decides not to become a killer and refuses to execute him, Butcher plays another recording, one where A-Train mocks Starlight, where he talks about women like objects, where he once again shows who he really is. And that is where it all ends. Without a sincere apology, without redemption, without having changed, A-Train dies decapitated, and for the first time in his life, he feels the same fear that he and the other soups made much weaker people feel for years. And I think that is the reason so many people ended up becoming attached to the show's A-Train, because he did not try to erase his mistakes or justify all the harm he caused. The only thing he did was try to be better. While the comic shows us someone incapable of changing, the show shows us someone who learns to live with the consequences of his actions. And even though he can never give Robin her life back, or repair all the damage he caused, or become a good person overnight, at least he tried. And in a world full of fake heroes, that is what ultimately made him one of them.